And also we'll talk about innovative finance in maritime industry. So we'll invite the first presenter, so Orestis Schinas from the Aegean University. He's
예정입니다.
Good morning from Athens. Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me? Γεια σου.
Τι κάνεις?
Μια χαρά, σας ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Okay, you are well presented here. So please share your PPT.
I hope that you can see my screen. I would like to thank you very much for the invitation. And it's always a pleasure to be among you guys, even if it is virtually. So today I will discuss the innovative green finance, and I would like to give a European perspective because that we experience many changes in Europe on this subject. Allow me to present the scheme where in this scheme what we actually have is a new framework of business. As you can see from the operation of the ships, you can, let's say, have operating losses and potential gains that is out of the financial outcome. So all of these financial schemes, all of these flows, they go to the bank. And this bank actually is, let's say, the facade, it is, let's say, the interface to the rest of the financial system. This is what we know so far. But in the carbon economy, and especially with the MRV, the Monitor Review Verification regulations, the EU ETS system, that is, let's say, the emission trading system that we have in Europe, and the voluntary carbon market under the United Nations, what we can see is that we can have negative outflows like losses that impact the operations, or we can also have, let's say, potential gains, in some cases opportunistic, from the voluntary markets. All of these, let's say, new flows are related to the emissions, are related to the carbon emissions from the operation of the ships. And this is, let's say, the new, if I'm allowed to say so, the new reality in shipping. So besides the pure financial flows, we have flows of money, we have flows of capital that relate directly to the carbon efficiency. All of these flows, at least in Europe, they are subjects of specific directives, let's say legislation. That is the SFDR and the CSRD, two instruments that I will discuss. And it's quite interesting because the MRVs, let's say, all generally the carbon allowances from the operation of the ships are, let's say, regulated, or at least they have to be reported to the financial institution, the bank. All of these decisions, of course, relate back to the, let's say, instrument that is the EU taxonomy. This is the instrument that practically dictates, mandates the financial institutions and funds in Europe how to allocate funds and how to finance projects. So I think that the first thing that we have to do is to understand the challenge of proper reporting. The European Directive on Corporate Sustainability Reporting has some very specific objectives. The first one is to improve transparency and accountability, and that means that there are enhanced disclosure requirements. The second point is to standardize reporting practices, and that is the establishment of common standards. And the third one is to promote sustainable business practices That means that we have to align our projects, the objectives of our projects, with the European Green Deal and the Paris Agreement. I remind you that the Green Deal is a set of laws, is a set of instruments in Europe that promote sustainability and generally promote the transition to a net zero economy. This is, let's say, the corporate sustainability reporting, but what is quite interesting is that there are some very interesting provisions. I'm not going to go in detail into details about the CSRD, but you can see that we have specific requirements that relate directly to ESG, environmental, social, governance factors. And this is, let's say, in most cases, mandatory, for example, for the environmental, but it can be voluntary for the social and governance. So what does it mean in practice? In practice means that besides the financial data, the financial results that should be reported, we have another set of data, and in particular the environmental, the CO2 emissions, and a data that relate, for example, to gender equality, transparency in governance, protection of minority rights. All of these have to be also disclosed. And as per the spirit of the regulation, what we have the so-called double materiality concept. That means that we have not only to prove that we save, for example, energy, that we save, let's say, resources, but at the same time, we have to prove that our operations, our business contribute further to the sustainability and generally to the resilience, the sustainable resilience of our project. All of these reporting standards, of course, they are based on the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. In my view, this is a great opportunity for technologically advanced economies like Korea to get into the new business. And of course, besides, let's say, the assurance and audit requirements, the mandatory third party, what is promoted is, let's say, the digital reporting. This is also based on a specific prototype that is the European Single Electronic Format. I think that this is a very, very important element in this piece of legislation because practically we have to digitize all our reporting, and that means we have to digitize all the back office and financial, let's say, procedures. So, in reality, what does this mean for our business? What does it mean for shipping? Besides operational changes and competitive advantages that can be provided, I think that there is a huge cost implication because by the digitization and by the need to report all of these environmental data emissions to the financial institutions, to funds and banks, what we try to do is that we try to minimize the friction cost of the operations, and we also try to introduce the environmental element, the environmental parameters in the financial decision making. So, the stakeholders, like investors and financial markets, have also a keen interest on that. Why? Because, as I said, besides the financial results that are communicated, there is a huge amount of data, environmental data, that impact their decision making. And this is linked not only to the taxonomy, but also to another piece of legislation, and this is the SFDR. I will come to this point very soon. The SFDR, as I said, is the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. And the aim of the regulation is to increase the sustainability, transparency within the finance industry by requiring financial institutions to offer standardized ESG disclosures to investors. In few words, it is a regulation that applies to banks and funds and says in very few words that besides financial results, besides financial information, you have to convey to investors and to regulators the full set of ESG. That means that all the data from, let's say, your clients, the ships, the ship owners, the shipping company, besides the financial data, the environmental data are also collected and aggregated at the level of the institution, bank or fund, and then communicate it to the investors. And the reason is this very difficult, let's say, part of the regulation, which is the Article 6, 8, and 9. That means that the financial institution has to classify the projects either to projects with a pure, let's say, sustainability objective, like Article 9, or let's say projects that support ESG initiatives, or projects that practically do not comply, or they do not have, let's say, a specific impact on the environmental footprint. In a nutshell, if you have a conventional ship to finance, that could be an Article 6 project. If you have to finance a ship that has, I don't know, a carbon capturing unit on board installed, wind assist technologies installed, and saves more than, I don't know, 15, 20% of energy, then this might be an Article 8 project. While a full hydrogen ship, if there was one, that would be an Article 9 project. And this is the very interesting part of this regulation, because investors come with an appetite. So, for example, investors ask for projects of Article 9 or Article 8, and then the fund or the bank should direct the funds to this direction. This is not always easy. So if you consider, let's say, the example of the hydrogen fuel ship, assume that we have investors with the appetite to finance hydrogen projects, then how many projects can you find in the market? And if you can find these projects in the market, then how can you, let's say, allocate funds today that and these funds will be utilized tomorrow? I mean, we need to consider also the long period of time where all these funds will remain unused. So, in my view, there is a huge opportunity from the sustainability-linked finance. This is a new reality, because as you can see, this is a graph that I really love to show. I mean, you can see that the top 40 ship finance banks are reducing their exposure. So you see that, for example, from 374 billion of dollars as exposure of the European banks back in 2010, we have more or less 143 today. And the Asian banks, mainly banks from China, Japan, and Korea, they have, let's say, increased their exposure from 66 to 127. So you see that the gap in the financing in the Far East and Europe has been practically been closed. But this is, let's say, old news. It is old news because ship finance, in terms of bank lending, is retreating. But you can see that the sustainable finance transaction for maritime ventures, especially bonds, is growing annually with a rate of 20%, while sustainability-linked loans with 17%. So we have many projects that are somehow linked to sustainability or sustainable finance products. It is quite interesting how we define them, because that is a question from the central regulators. However, you can see that besides the, let's say, the big, let's say, the issues that we had in 2020 because of the pandemic, then in 2021 and in 2022, the statistics show an increase of the interest and the increase of sustainable finance transactions. So, in few words, why the emergence of sustainability-linked finance is so interesting? I think that first of all, we have a link of the EU policies with specific, let's say, operational goals, and also with some wider policy objectives. You can see the ease of compliance. That means that we reduce the man hours and effort, and that means that we reduce administrative burden. We have enhanced trust to the ESG data. That is the trust along the reporting chain, and this is, let's say, the big opportunity of digitizing all processes. And of course, all of these deem audit irrelevant, as data are available online 24/7. And that means that the audit and other formalities can be reduced. Is that so important? Maybe it is, because as you know, when the capital is scarce, when the investors have appetites that we have to satisfy, then the availability of data and the availability of credible data that can support decisions are very interesting. Allow me to tell you that out of market sources in Europe, there are companies already that prepare, if I may use the term, prepare the whole package of the securitization. So when you have a project before going out in the market, finding a bank or equity investors or whatever, there is, let's say, a full package of services that is, let's say, available. And then the only thing that you need to get as, let's say, a ship owner or generally somebody who is seeking of finance is the right, not teaser, but the right, let's say, set of digital data that is communicated with many investors, and that speeds up all the procedures. In few words, what I would like to say is that the less cost and effort to apply and monitor performance, the lower the cost and therefore the higher the margin. The big question here is, of course, the trusted data. And we have to trust the data. We have to be certain for the data. And of course, we cannot allow greenwashing, suspicions, or any other, gray zones. So I think that what could be very interesting also for your audience before I conclude is lessons learned and the missed opportunity of the EU ETS. As you know, um, the EU ETS is already in place. Ships that are calling European ports, they follow, let's say, a specific rule, and then they have to surrender allowances in the EU ETS system, regardless of the flag. So, for many years, the shipping industry has been resistant to the ETS. It is the fear of the unknown, it is the lack of data, the resistance of change, and of course, the availability of capital. As you can see, and I think that most of you follow the discussions at the IMO, there were many, there are still many discussions about the ETS, if it is going to be a global one, if we're going to have regional ETS systems, and generally the discussions about the market-based measures on carbon is, let's say, a very vivid one. The problem, at least in Europe, was that the ETS system was already in place for all other industries. So shipping was an exemption. So it was not easy or politically, let's say, possible to keep this to keep shipping outside of the regulatory framework. And the industry, if I may say so, and especially in Europe, was let's say not even discussing easily the option of the ETS as a possible market-based measure. What actually happened was that shipping was incorporated into the system without free allowances. It is the first industry, I think, that enters the system without free allowances. I remind you that other land-based industries, they got free allowances of almost 70% of the burden for many years. There is no selling right, so even if you generate allowances, you do not have the right to sell them. You have only the right to purchase. That means that ETS is similar to a levy, and this is also a very unique feature for the shipping industry. And we have a very swift phase-in scheme that is from 40% in 2024 to 100% in 2026. That means that we need to have full compliance within 3 years. So the interesting here part is that the finance of the ships depends on ESG. That means that depends on CO2 equivalent emissions efficiency. And the finance for the business as usual case is not really possible, because in the financial cash flows and all the investment proposals, I mean, all the data and projections that you prepare for the banks, then you have to include the ETS, the levy that you're going to pay in Europe when your ship is called in, where your ship is calling European ports. Some of you might say there is no need to call European ports. I mean, there is a huge universe outside of Europe. Why should we call them? Yeah, that could be a very interesting, let's say, topic for discussion. But when you buy ships, then you buy ships to trade globally. And if you consider this, let's say, financial burden on your cash flow models that comes from the CO2 equivalent, then we have also to consider the voluntary carbon markets and other markets that can facilitate environmental performance, or let's say can facilitate improved environmental performance. So all of this is part of the interesting, let's say, equation of translating energy efficiency to monetary terms for our project. So, about to conclude, I think that decarbonization is high in the global agenda and there is no turning back. The funds will be allocated as per the environmental performance of assets. That means that the central banks will ask commercial banks and, of course, funds to allocate their available funds per sector, and this allocation will be based not on the financial returns or risks, but mainly on the CO2 equivalent emissions. Have we already, let's say, samples or, let's say, have already seen this kind of movements? Yes, there are already financial institutions in banks, in Europe, that link the internal allocation of funds with the CO2 emissions, because at their level, when they aggregate all the sectors and projects they finance, then they have also to follow the trajectory of CO2 emissions. They have to show to their investors that the total CO2 that is emitted from all projects, from all sectors, is also following a trajectory towards net zero emissions in 2050. The price of carbon has, of course, an impact on the financial results. Why? Because ETS is there, voluntary carbon markets are there. So we need to consider carbon as one more parameter of risk. Do we have already calculations for that? Yes, of course. Is it, let's say, short-term financing, or can we also consider it as long-term financing? In most cases, for the moment, it is still short-term, but I can assure you that the price of carbon will enter the cash flow models the very same way as we have, let's say, oil prices in our models. Not maybe with a different set of risk parameters, but it will be present. And of course, in my view, this is a big opportunity. This is the new El Dorado in shipping for digital technology and data collection. This is the key to success. So the more digitized the company, the more efficient it is, definitely, and prepared for the future. The industry needs globally applied rules to keep trade free and, in my unrestricted. This is the most important point. Technology can help and can tell the good from the bad operator. Because you can also see not only the financial results, but also the operational results. The operational results imply also lower CO2 emissions, and winners use modern technical and financial tools. CSDR and CFDR result in strict reporting requirements. This is the new universe, at least in Europe. Digital and streamlined reporting is necessary to keep compliance costs at the minimal level. All operators have to have ESG data properly communicated with their financial institutions, or let's say with the counterparties. And of course, the expected burden increases, but technology is available. In my view, I think that ESG data is, let's say, the proper collection and communication of ESG data is, let's say, the key to, let's say, new sustainable finance. It is the key for new products. My 2 cents, I mean, my humble opinion. EU banks will allocate funds as per ESG criteria, and that will change dramatically the competition among financial institutions. I think that this will, in most cases, lead to a reduction, or let's say to at least a decrease of the exposure of the EU lending, because the European central authorities ask for, let's say, the decarbonization at all levels. So banks cannot be excluded. so the aggregate of all projects and sectors that the banks are financing should reduce the CO2 emissions. Shipping is still high in the emissions as, let's say, a sector with emissions, regardless the environmental friendliness of ships per se. But I think that this is, let's say, part of the future. I think that we're going to have higher technological risk, but this implies also higher yield and also new appetite of investors for returns. So I don't necessarily see that green ships or sustainable or projects with a very clear sustainable character is let's say a burden. I think that they have a higher risk, therefore a higher yield. Therefore, we have to find the right investors, but there is appetite in the market. The tier one clients will have more opportunities as usually, and they can concentrate capital. They can also test innovation. They can also, let's say, work with more sophisticated partners. This is always so. So I think that the tier one clients will always have more opportunities in the market. And of course, alternative sources will emerge to fill the gap, mainly funds of all sorts that will bring fresh capital into the market. Um, this is it. Thank you, Busan, for the invitation. And I'm here for, I mean, I'm happy to get your questions. Thank you very much.